Hey, my name's Matt from Cinefit Inc. and I thought I would share a couple things I've learned about using an iPhone for creating talking head content, which I think a lot of people do. And I think there's a lot of people out there who have some great things to share, but are concerned about spending a lot of money on maybe some equipment. But you can get a really nice shot from an iPhone, a nice frame for a video that you can share that looks better than just setting up an iPhone, turning it on and hitting the record button. But there's a couple things that you need to learn about or at least know about the iPhone that I think is important. And once you know the limitations of the iPhone, you can work within those limitations to make a great frame. So this is for all of you that don't really want to spend the money on an expensive camera, but you want to create some great content with a nice frame, an appealing frame that keeps your audience interested. I will say this, there's a lot of pretty frames out there and the content is really boring in my perspective. So to me, the most important thing is the content. The second after the content is, the look of the frame and those kind of things. I think you are the compelling piece and your content is the compelling piece. And then the third compelling piece may be your frame and your lighting and things like that. So if you're going to use an iPhone, it's a great tool to use. Let's just talk about some of the limitations. Number one, you have a small sensor. And in my experience, because I love cinematography so much, I've learned that the physics dictate that the smaller your sensor is, the sensor that's capturing the image and the light like a piece of film emulsion would, the smaller that is, the deeper your depth of field. And so everything's going to be in focus even if you have a longer lens. For example, in an iPhone 11 Pro or an iPhone 12 Pro, if you happen to have one of those, you have a third lens that gives you this telephoto option. It's a 50 millimeter or 52 millimeter lens. That's a nice lens to have because it's longer, but it's not going to give you any depth of field. Everything's still going to be in focus. And so what you're going to see in the back, just like you see in my frame, is everything's in focus. The wall is in focus. The cameras in the back are in focus. The guitar is in focus. My cases are pretty much in focus. You're not seeing a lot of blurring. There's a little bit that's out of focus, but for the most part, the depth of this entire room, which isn't a huge room, but it's all in focus. Is that a downside to recording? It's kind of nice to have a frame where the focus is on the person and everything else is kind of blurred in the background, but I would say you can do some tricks to overcome that. And one of the things is just a trick in lighting and just to light your background with less light than what you're giving your foreground or the subject. So what I've done is I'm brighter in the scene than anything else. And one of the tools you can use to do that is a light meter. That might be getting a little more geeky into the cinematography side, but I love what I've learned about the light meter and just getting levels in a frame down so that you pop. And for as much as you'd spend on, say, a mirrorless camera or something else, you could spend half that, a third of that, a fourth of that on a light meter and end up in a great place with a light meter and an iPhone. So that's number one. Number two, one of the things that the iPhone cameras do not have is a manual aperture. That's that iris that opens and closes and lets light in. So the more light you can let in, or your ability to close down an aperture, you don't have on an iPhone. It's fixed. It's fixed to be very open. I believe it's like a 1.4 or 1.6 f-stop, which is very wide, lets in a lot of light. But what I would suggest is getting a program like Filmic Pro so that you're not leaving your aperture on automation, meaning it's not an automatic aperture that's opening and closing, as it were, the aperture, or letting it get brighter and darker as you're doing a scene. With Filmic Pro or some other apps, I'm familiar with Filmic Pro and it's a very good app, you can basically lock down your aperture. And I think you can even do that in the iPhone, is lock down your aperture just by hitting that button, holding that focus, and then it'll lock down your focus and your aperture. You can control that amount of light through what's called shutter speed. And that's the workaround for the aperture. So it still works. It's a fixed aperture. It's not as good as having the control of an iris. And some of that control of an iris even affects depth of field. It wouldn't for an iPhone, even if they were capable of putting an actual mechanical iris in there. It wouldn't impact depth of field because the sensor, like I said, is so small. But the workaround is to control your shutter. One of the things that I've learned about the iPhone sensor is that you have to work within the sensor's best range for light. That's without getting too complicated. What I defaulted was to put that sensor or the shutter speed in probably the middle location. So I wasn't opening up or slowing down the shutter speed so much that I got the whole 1.4, 1.6 aperture light coming on the sensor, but I also didn't close it down or increase the shutter speed enough so that I was so dark. I actually set it in the middle with at about 1/72 of a second. I don't know if that's ideal, but right now that's what you're seeing on this frame, is 1/72 of a second of amount of light. And so if I turn my key light off, you can actually see that it's pretty dark. The frame's dark, and I actually have another softbox on some light in the back. If I turn that off, you can see it's pretty dark. The other lights are my ceiling lights. So I'm working in a dark frame, but the idea was my background would be dark enough, and then I'd pull up me in the foreground with enough light to pop in the frame. I can't remember. This is really a lot of feel as I'm looking at a monitor over here to kind of look for where best am I lit comparison to the other things. But there's a lot of feel to this. It's an art. So hopefully I'm not too bright there. So that's number 2. Number 3 is something maybe a consumer wouldn't really appreciate, and some people I find don't even notice this. But I notice it because I have always, my entire life, I've loved cinematography, and I'm always striving to, how can a digital camera look more like film? That is been one of my great goals in life ever since digital cameras came out. Even before the iPhone, I thought it was 24 frames per second. I thought it was shallow depth of field and all these things. After so many years of learning, what I have learned about something to make it look really like film, the most important thing is lighting. That you can have control of. You can make something look much more cinematic by controlling the lighting. The things we attribute to something as cinematic and beautiful is because these great artists, directors of photography and cinematographers, same thing, they've learned to master painting with light. And that is making things have more depth in your image, and making things pop in your image, or focusing your face on certain things. A lot of things are subconscious, but an artist knows where to get you to focus. Painters know how to do it too. And that's a career or an endeavor in lighting and understanding how light affects things. That's the greatest impact you'll ever get on your image. It's not going to be your camera and things like that. I'm going a little bit far, but what I want to go, and that's something we can delve into later with some other content, because I love that aspect of cinematography. What can you do to make an image great even with a less than professional camera? There's a lot. That's what they won't tell you. That's what marketers of new cameras won't tell you. That's what, the world, the consumer world doesn't tell you. And the reason why is because they want to sell more cameras, they want to sell more TVs and things like that. But there is a truth to cinematography. And the greatest truth is if you want to make something look great, learn how to light a scene. And that you can do with cheap lights. You can get some expensive lights, and having that control over dimming and things like that is really great. But I digress. What I want to say is the third thing about an iPhone camera that other professional cameras have, and mirrorless cameras and prosumer cameras have, is what's called dynamic range. They have a higher dynamic range than an iPhone does. It's what I would attribute to why certain things on an iPhone look more like video and less like film. And a lot of people don't even notice it, because I see on TVs things that you're like, that doesn't look good. I mean, that scene looks so bad, and it was shot on an Arri SXT or an Arri LF with fantastic lenses, and yet the monitor, the TV, is so bad with dynamic range that it crushes the blacks and blows out the whites, and you don't get this really organic filmic look that these cameras have been able to get. The truth of physics, at least as I understand it, is the film emulsion on a camera is it had really wide dynamic range. You could get detail in very dark images, very dark things. And even in some of the brightest light on the frame, you could see detail in the whites and in the reflections in mirrors and things like that. That truly, after 15 years of understanding, is the reason why something looks more filmic than, say, an iPhone video. Note, and the reason why I set up my room this way is so that you can see that difference. Take a look at this softbox right here. To my eye, I can see threading. There's a lot of detail in there. There's actually even a microphone, a shotgun microphone in front of it. You can just barely see the front head of the microphone reflecting right there. You can't see any of that detail with an iPhone. Given the amount of light that's given on this sensor, you don't get any of that detail. It's crushed. We say crushed. Basically, it disappears into the black ether, right? The other thing that happens is, and I don't have as good of an example here but probably the brightest spot would be right over here in this corner. I'm just out of frame is a ceiling light. If you were to look very deeply there, you wouldn't be able to see any of the detail of the cement brick, of the cinder block brick in my beautiful basement studio. You wouldn't see that detail because it blows it out. Whereas if you saw something framed on a mirrorless camera or an image that was shot on an Arri Alexa, or even some of the Blackmagic cameras, which you'll pay for, you get a lot more dynamic range. Multiple stops, 10 to 15 stops of dynamic range. That's a measurement in light. You don't have to worry about it. Just know that we are looking at an iPhone camera, and the image off of an iPhone the dynamic range of that image is very much limited than what you'd get on another camera. Is that so bad for talking head, content? I don't think so. I don't think people really care that much. It does make a difference. You can see the difference. But like I said, I think the content, what you're saying, what you're teaching people, what you're sharing with people, and your presence, your personality is much more important than whether or not you have dynamic range in your image. That said, you can use an iPhone, if you understand these limitations, you can use an iPhone to at least pull out some of that dynamic range that exists. You can take advantage. It still has dynamic range, it just doesn't have as much. So in my example, what I try to do here is make me pop, right? I'm not flat, meaning I'm not at the same level of lighting that my background is. And I used a light meter to do that. I lowered the amount of reflective light that's hitting the sensor here from the background than how much reflective light is coming off my face and hitting the sensor. So I pop and the background kind of muddles into the back, right? And that's the idea, is controlling that light so you've got a more interesting frame, a more interesting thing. This is pretty basic stuff. I would never say that this frame is beautiful, but it's better than just turning on a camera and hitting the record button. And I've done a little bit to adjust the lights to make it look better than just keeping all the lights on. There are things you can do. We can go into more of this. I'd love to share more, and I plan to, but this was the first thing. I hope this helps. The great takeaway is don't dismiss what an iPhone can do. You can still get a good frame and a great piece of content out there that's helpful to people and looks great. There are other things, other aspects we can talk about, like the amount of audio or the type of audio that you use as opposed to using the microphone on the iPhone. I've chosen to use a lavalier, and pretty inexpensive lavalier. And I'm using that as second sound and matching it in an NLE called Final Cut Pro that lets me sync the sound, and that sound makes a huge difference. So that's another thing you can do. But we'll talk about that at another time. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. I hope it got you inspired to, hey, you don't need to go out and buy a really expensive camera, an iPhone 11 or iPhone 12, especially the Pro. They're great cameras. And in fact, I'm not using the 50 millimeter. I'm using what would be in the iPhone 11 or the iPhone 12 camera. And I think the 12 camera is even more improved. So good luck. Get that content out there. I say don't stop. And we'll see you next time.